Well, as if you hadn't had enough of John Winthrop, there are a couple of other selections I want us to look at very briefly anyway. As you can imagine, even with people who've signed on to a system of government like this, it couldn't have been an easy system of government to live with, especially when you're putting an awful lot of faith and trust in just a handful of upper class guys, and I do mean guys. Winthrop obviously came under some severe criticism for his governance, and his best two statements on political philosophy really deserve to take a closer look. One of them is called The Defense of an Order of Court in 1637, and the other one is called The Speech to the General Court, and both of these kind of lay out some classic things that he has to say. We won't go through all of it, but on page 199 in my volume 1, he makes his defense. He'd been accused of essentially overstepping his bounds, going beyond his limits of authority, and the important thing to look at is the fact that he goes over yet again this organic notion of society and the proper view of the council. If you look on page 199, it's actually a reply to the guy named Lane that they had been talking about there. There was a little bit of a squabble going on. A declaration of the intent and equity of the order made at the last court to this effect, that none should be received to inhabit within this jurisdiction but such as should be allowed by some of the magistrates. In other words, basically, he's defending his decision not to allow people to live in that part of Massachusetts without signing on to their way of life, their belief system, etc. And why don't you let people who aren't necessarily Puritans live there in Boston or wherever? And so he makes a defense of his decision on that score of being exclusive. And he talks about, on page 199, the essential form of a commonwealth. What is the essential form of a commonwealth or body politic such as this is, which I conceive to be this: the consent of a certain company of people to cohabit together under one government for their mutual safety and welfare. So what he's saying is, look, a commonwealth, a common ordered society, is essentially a covenant or a group of people coming together and consenting to live under a set of rules. If you don't agree to live under those set of rules, you're not joining our commonwealth. You're not joining our society. You're not deciding to live by our way, means that you're not wanting to be part of our group. That is the essential aspect of a society, that it agrees to live by certain rules. Our rules may not be ones that you want. Go find another place to live. That's his position. On the next page, on 200, he says, from these premises will arise these conclusions. 1, no commonwealth can be founded but by free consent, meaning everybody's been here, everybody signed on, since day one, everybody signed on with the same rules. We haven't changed the rules on you. Number 2, the persons so incorporating have a public and relative interest each in other, and in the place of their cohabitation in goods and laws, etc., and in all the means of their welfare, so that none other can claim privilege with them but by free consent. In other words, I have an interest in you and what you do. It matters to me what you do. If you go out and do something stupid or foolish that jeopardizes the community, then you shouldn't be allowed to do that. And essentially, by living with me, you at least tacitly consent that you will abide by a certain form of behavior that the community sees as being approved or acceptable. Number 3, the nature of such an incorporation ties every member thereof to seek out and entertain all means that may conduce to the welfare of the body, and to keep off whatsoever doth appear to tend to their damage organic society. Number 4, the welfare of the whole is not to be put at apparent hazard for the advantage of any particular members. We have this notion that minority rights trump the majority. Winthrop would say that is insanity. Not so. Your right to do what you want, it takes a very, very big backseat to the society's right to govern itself the way it sees fit. What you do, if it puts to apparent hazard the welfare of the society, can very much be outlawed or have you thrown in jail from that. From these conclusions, I thus reason 1, 2, 3. Take a look at 3. If we are bound to keep off whatsoever appears to tend to our ruin or damage, Then may we lawfully refuse to receive such whose dispositions suit not with ours, and whose society we know will be hurtful to us, and therefore it is lawful to take knowledge of all men before we receive them. In other words, I'm not being a bad guy because I'm not allowing people to come live here who don't agree with the way we believe and live. I'm actually protecting the commonwealth that already exists here, and I'm informing people in advance, you can't come live here unless you consent to our way of life. And if they say, no, I want to come live there anyway, and I want to be part of your society, but I don't want to live the way you do, then I'm within my right as governor to tell them they can't come live here. Okay? On page 201, he even goes over the intent of laws. He says, the intent of the law is to preserve the welfare of the body, and for this end, to have none received into any fellowship with it who are likely to disturb the same. He then goes on to say that the council that governs the colony is like a jury. Okay? He says, yet is the jury bound to condemn him according to their own consciences, and not to acquit him upon the different opinion of other men. It's not something that's open to public opinion. This is a jury. The jury members can vote on what to do, but it's not something that's put to a general plebiscite. Not everybody gets a vote. Okay? That, again, kind of rubs us the wrong way because we have very democratic sensibilities. But if you'll look over here on page 205, his classic statement of Puritan political theory, Winthrop's speech to the General Court, this is, by the way, after having been acquitted in a trial. He was put on trial of exceeding his authority as magistrate. This was in 1645. He had actually been put on trial for this. And he makes a very, very good defense, I have to say. He does argue that the voter mandate reflects God's will, which is unusual because he's not a big, small d Democrat. So he admonishes people, when you elect magistrates, you need to choose carefully, because kind of like electing Pope in a way. The vote is a reflection of God's will, and once the vote is taken, you need to accept it. At the bottom of page 206, he says, there is a twofold liberty. Now, this is really important. Natural, right, liberty, and then civil or federal liberty. Okay, let's talk about this. He says the first, or natural liberty, is common to man with beasts and other creatures. It is the liberty to do what he lists or what you want. Okay, it's the liberty to do evil as well as to do good. So that's sort of freedom in the natural state. You can just go do what you want to. If you just want to run around in the woods naked or whatever, or just take someone's stuff, that's natural liberty, meaning you have the ability as a free-willed creature to do what you want to do, whether it's good or evil. Okay, this liberty is incompatible and inconsistent with authority. In other words, if you're going to live in a civil society that's ordered and that has authority figures in it and the rule of law, you cannot live as though you have natural liberty. You have to give some of that up, you see. You can't run around the woods naked, sorry. You can't take people's stuff whenever you want to, sorry. And you cannot endure the least restraint of the most just authority. The other kind of liberty I call civil or federal, it may be also termed moral, is a liberty to that only which is good, just, and honest. Okay? Actually, it's a liberty from bad things. Okay? Social contract theory is emerging here. It's not fully developed, but it's emerging, you see. When you if you put all of these writings by Winthrop together, it's not hard to see that they are on the cusp of developing a sort of social contract theory, even though they're hanging on to the organic notion of society. Because what they're saying is, look, you enter into it by consent. You have to give up certain liberties in order to be assured of certain liberties. There are two types of liberty, etc. I don't think Thomas Hobbes would have put it this way, and Rousseau certainly would have put it this way. But you're inching closer to that. You see, that notion that, well, you joined and therefore you've got obligations, the state has obligations, you have to do certain things, the state has to do certain things, and you can't just go do what you want willy-nilly, you give up certain, et cetera, okay? And the consent of the governed is a reflection of God's will. That's not something that you would see under the social contract theory, but you certainly see that here. A couple of other things here, some shorter selections in here you can take a peek at to serve to illustrate that the notion of Puritanism as embracing religious tolerance is a myth. I would especially have you look at Nathaniel Ward's Simple Cobbler of Agawam, where he just basically says, if you think that we are here to spread religious toleration, you are wrong. Cotton's letter to Lord say and seal. Down at the bottom of page 209, you see that no man fashioneth his house to his hangings, but his hangings to his house. Okay? There's a rhetorical flourish for you. It is better that and hangings means his furnishings, right? Nobody builds a house around furnishings, but he builds his furnishings. He furnishes his house after it's built. It is better that the commonwealth be fashioned to the setting forth of God's house, which is his church, than to accommodate the church frame to the civil state. In other words, what we did is we set up a government here that was what we thought was consistent with the way God wanted it built. Then we're going to pass laws. But we're not going to do it the other way around, right? We're not going to create a civil society and then hope that the church can survive within it. Our whole purpose in coming here was to set up a new society that was a church society, and then make sure that the civil society is both subservient to it and consistent with it. Democracy, I do not conceive that ever God did ordain as a fit government either for church or commonwealth. Well, that blows that myth out of the water from Mrs. McGillicuddy's 6th grade civics class, huh? They did not come over here to spread democracy. If you look at Mitchell's text, Nehemiah on the Wall, here we go. Now that you have a good firm notion of the Puritan views on democracy and authority and organic versus civil society and how they're constituted and what they ought to be like, when you read this text, which is a much later text than some of the earlier ones, it's clear that Mitchell is drawing parallels between the Puritans and the Old Testament Hebrews, implying that the form of governance today should be as it was in Old Testament times. So they're not just creating a church that mimics the early church in the early AD times. They're trying to create a civil society that looks very much like the latter BC times under the kings and judges, and particularly the judges of the Old Testament. Right? So if you look on page 239, for example, he talks extensively about the parallels or similarities between the Jews and the Puritans here. They were a small, weak, and despised people, he says. So are we. They were in the midst of enemies and adversaries round about them of several sorts and nations. So are we. Their adversaries did labor to affright them with the accusation of rebellion. Same here. There were discontents and divisions among themselves. Oh, alas, there are amongst us as well. On page 240, they were poor and low and weak as to outward estate. Hence there was hard work and weak, instruments ready many times to be discouraged. It was a time of many fears, and so on and so forth. Which was worst of all, among this people of the Jews after captivity, they engaged in reforming work. There were many sins, disorders, and miscarriages which were provoking unto God and a great exercise of discouragement to their faithful leaders. Number 9 on page 241, lastly, we may remember the long time wherein this poor people were conflicting and laboring under difficulties and infirmities, and so on and so forth. And so what he's saying is, we chose the form of government that we have for a reason, and there is biblical precedent for it, and in fact, the more we shape our society like the Old Testament, the more we see the parallels between ourselves and them typology, right? Which is a sort of backhanded way of validating what they're doing. If what we're doing looks a lot like the Old Testament, and it looks a lot like the Jews of the Old Testament, looks a lot like what the Bible has, we must be doing it right.